The experience of imperialism illustrates how concepts of racial superiority developed among European societies at the end of the 19th century. At the same time as these ideas became widespread in Europe, anxieties about racial mixing and social degeneration appeared and connected to issues of nationalism and European competition. This week's module examines the uncertainty of the fin de siècle and the broad development of notions of racism in Western society. The ideal of Western superiority was allegedly proven by the West's dominance during imperial expansion. The relative ease of conquering both Asia and Africa led Europeans to believe in their inherent superiority over other peoples. One obvious example of this, as far as Europeans were concerned, was their technological superiority. The conquest of empire brought new goods into the internal markets of Europe, transforming consumer values and bringing the fruits of empire to more and more Europeans. This expansion of consumption also helps to explain how notions of superiority, as expressed by Kipling and Rhodes, were embraced more broadly in society. Through consumer goods, elite racial attitudes easily crossed class boundaries through a phenomenon termed commodity racism. This phenomenon was particularly prevalent in Britain, although it was operant in numerous Western societies. The expansion of consumerism at the end of the 19th century only further contributed to this. As an example, here is a Pear soap advertisement from the late 19th century, in which the attitudes of racial superiority are expressed through caricatures of children. In the advertisement, the African child wishes to wash like the white child. Often, soap was promoted as an example of Western superiority in terms of comparative civilization. Two more examples here show how racial language in iconography was evident in the sale of consumer goods in Europe, with the Pear's advertisement here actually using the phrase white man's burden to define the use of soap. The imagery again illustrates how non-Westerners were viewed as lesser and often as children. Consumer goods were just one element of the justification of racial superiority. The appearance of new scientific theories, including Charles Darwin's notion of natural selection, contributed to notions of biological differences between the races, especially between the more evolved Western so-called races and the quote-unquote Orientals, those so-called races in the East. Science in this case served to promote racist notions of superiority as well as calling for the existence of racial hierarchies, with white Europeans believed to be on top. Not only did scientific disciplines such as biology serve to illustrate Europeans' belief in racial superiority, but new pseudosciences contributed as well. For example, a new discipline, criminology, which has now become legitimate, postulated the relationship between crime and the so-called lower races. The founder of criminology, Cesare Lombroso, integrated racist concepts into his text Criminal Man, which in essence noted that criminals were born as such. Other disciplines, such as craniometry and eugenics, also emphasized racial difference. This image from a science textbook from the 19th century reveals how notions of racial superiority and difference were pervasive within the so-called objective ideas of science. Here, 3 different skulls are used to prove, quote-unquote, the dramatic difference between Europeans and Africans, while also suggesting that Africans were closer to chimpanzees. The prevalence of racism in all quarters of European societies show how powerful it had become as a way of seeing the world. One of the reasons for the expansion of racism during this period was the appearance of anxieties connected to social changes at the end of the 19th century, both in Western Europe and the United States. The continued process of industrialization expanded the working class and led to greater immigration from the East. The increased population of immigrants, coupled with the declining birth rates of the European middle class, created fears of an overwhelming tide of outsiders taking over European society. One of the most famous incidents that reveals this fear was the Dreyfus Affair in France. France was an immigrant society, meaning that immigrants could become French. However, some groups often came under suspicion from some elements of society. Alfred Dreyfus was an officer in the French General Staff, the most important organization that ran the army. Dreyfus was the youngest officer who had advanced very quickly within the General Staff. He was also Jewish, which made him the object of suspicion among many of the other officers. When a spy was discovered in the General Staff, Dreyfus was immediately accused. Evidence was fabricated against Dreyfus, who was convicted as a traitor. Even though the spying continued after his imprisonment, the French army stuck by its decision, even though Dreyfus was obviously innocent. Once the actions of the army became public, the French became divided between those supporting the army and those supporting Dreyfus. Anti-Semitism was a big part of this decision. The so-called lower races, Irish, Italians, Jews, and Poles, were blamed for the social problems that gripped Europe at the end of the 19th century, such as alcoholism, prostitution, and crime. The expansion of population in the cities also led to fears of crowds. The notion of decadence, the decay of white superiority, became a social concern as well, and the appearance of psychoanalysis, anarchism, and terrorism all led Europeans to think that racial mixing was causing the collapse of Western civilization. The anxieties of race meant that the promise of progress of the 19th century had met with darker notions of racism, creating a hostility in Europe that would cloud over the real material progress made in Western society and prepare it for the dark days ahead.